The galaxy was old, very old, and the beings who ruled it believed they knew everything worth knowing. For 3,000 years, 6 powerful races had controlled the stars. They called themselves the Elder Races, and together they formed the Galactic Hegemony. They had built space stations larger than moons. They had created ships that could cross the galaxy in days. They had weapons that could destroy entire planets with a single shot. And they were very, very proud. Captain stood on the bridge of her survey vessel, looking at the holographic display floating before her. Her blue skin glowed softly in the dim light as she scrolled through thousands of files. Each file contained information about a different planet, a different species. Most were marked with red symbols meaning primitive, or no threat, or simply irrelevant. She stopped at one file and laughed. "Earth," she said to her assistant, a young officer named, "have you ever read about this world?" Walked over and looked at the display. He saw images of a small blue planet with one moon. The beings living there had 2 arms, 2 legs, and soft skin in various shades of brown and pink. They wore strange clothes and lived in square buildings made of stone and metal. Humans, read from the file. Class 7 pre-spacefaring civilization. They discovered fire 100,000 years ago but still have not left their planet. They fight wars over invisible lines they draw on maps. They burn dead plants for energy. Estimated time until interstellar travel, 800 years minimum. Laughed again. 800 years, and that is being generous. Look at them. They cannot even stop fighting each other long enough to build a proper spacecraft. She closed the file and moved on to more important matters. Far across the galaxy, on a massive space station called Nexus Prime, Ambassador was attending a meeting of the Grand Council. He was and his body was covered in beautiful scales that changed color with his mood. Right now, they were bright green, the color of amusement. "I have a joke for you all," he announced to the gathered representatives. "What takes 100,000 years to discover but still has not managed it?" The other ambassadors made sounds of curiosity. "Humans," said, and the chamber filled with laughter. There were clicks and whistles and deep rumbling sounds as dozens of alien species expressed their amusement. The crystalline beings chimed like bells. The insect-like rubbed their legs together in rapid patterns. Even the ancient void walkers, who rarely showed emotion, let out low vibrations of humor. High Arbiter, a being made entirely of living crystal, pulsed with soft light. "Indeed," he said in his resonating voice. "The humans are a perfect example of evolutionary failure, a species with potential that will never be realized." "Should we not help them?" asked a young representative from a minor species. "Share our technology, guide their development." The laughter stopped. Ambassador's scales shifted to orange, the color of condescension. "Help them? Why would we waste resources on such a primitive species? They would not even understand our simplest technology. It would be like teaching mathematics to insects." The young representative fell silent, embarrassed. Admiral commanded the Hegemony's 3rd Fleet, one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. She sat in her ready room aboard the battleship Eternal Light, reviewing reports from across her territory. Her 4 eyes scanned the data quickly, processing information at speeds no human could match. Her aide, Lieutenant, who had recently transferred from Captain's survey vessel, entered with a data pad. "Admiral, I have the weekly intelligence summary." "Anything interesting?" "Not really, ma'am. Some pirate activity near the rim, a trade dispute between 2 minor species," and he hesitated. "And what?" "Earth has gone dark." Looked up, mildly curious. "Dark." "Yes, ma'am. No electromagnetic signals, no radio waves, no television broadcasts, complete silence for the past 40 years. 40 years, frowned. Why am I only hearing about this now? Shifted uncomfortably. Earth was classified as low priority. The monitoring station only checks the file once every 50 years. They noticed the silence during routine review. Leaned back in her chair, thinking, then she shrugged. Their civilization probably collapsed. It happens to pre-spacefaring species all the time. Climate change, nuclear war, disease. Humans were particularly fond of destroying themselves. Should we send a probe to confirm? Why waste the fuel? Dead species tell no tales, and there are no resources on Earth worth claiming. Mark the file as probable extinction and move on. Nodded and left. And so Earth was forgotten again. The truth was, no one in the hegemony cared about humanity. They were too small, too weak, too primitive to matter. The elder races had seen hundreds of species rise and fall over what was one more. On Nexus Prime, Ambassador continued to use humans as a punchline in his jokes. Even the learned to fly before they learned to think, he would say, but humans learn to think and still cannot fly. High Arbiter quoted human history in his lectures about evolutionary dead ends. They had nuclear weapons before they had world peace, he would say, his crystal body pulsing with disapproval. A species that builds tools of extinction before tools of unity is doomed to destroy itself. Captain eventually retired and wrote a book about primitive species. The chapter on humans was 3 pages long, mostly filled with mockery. And in the deep silence of space, 40 light-years from Nexus Prime, the small blue planet called Earth continued to orbit its yellow sun. No signals came from its surface. No ships left its atmosphere. To any observer, it appeared to be exactly what the hegemony believed it was. Dead, silent, forgotten. But appearances can be deceiving. Deep beneath the surface of Earth's moon, in tunnels that no alien sensor had ever detected, something was happening. Massive construction bays stretched for kilometers, filled with the skeleton frames of ships larger than anything the galaxy had ever seen. In orbit around Jupiter, hidden by the gas giant's enormous radiation field, factories worked day and night. They produced armor plating, weapon systems, and engine cores using technology that humanity had developed entirely on its own. And on Earth itself, 8 billion humans went about their daily lives, acting perfectly normal, pretending nothing had changed. They drove their cars. They watched their televisions. They argued about politics and sports and celebrity gossip. But every single one of them knew the truth. They knew that 40 years ago, humanity had discovered they were not alone in the universe. They knew that the galaxy was ruled by arrogant beings who saw them as insects. They knew that these beings had already decided humanity's fate without ever bothering to ask. And they knew that humanity had decided to prove them wrong. The galaxy had dismissed Earth as irrelevant. The elder races had laughed at human weakness and human stupidity and human limitations. They would not be laughing much longer. The war came without warning. They had always been different from the other elder races. They were insects, billions of individual bodies sharing one collective mind. They did not think like other species. They did not feel like other species. And they had never accepted being treated as lesser members of the hegemony. For centuries they had waited, they had grown, they had built. And now they attacked. Commander stood on the bridge of the destroyer Swift Blade, watching the tactical display with growing horror. Red dots filled the screen, each one representing an enemy ship. He counted them quickly in his head, then counted again, hoping he had made a mistake. He had not. 300 bioships were approaching station. His defense fleet had 12 vessels. "All ships report status," said into his communicator. His voice was calm, but his heart was pounding. "Swift Blade ready, Commander. Iron Shield standing by. Brave Star prepared for combat." One by one, his captains checked in. 12 ships, 12 crews, perhaps 3,000 soldiers in total, facing an enemy force that outnumbered them 25 to 1. Ensign Myra, his tactical officer, turned from her console. She was young, barely 25 years old, with short black hair and serious eyes. "Commander, should we call for reinforcements?" "I already did. The nearest fleet is 6 hours away," looked at the approaching swarm. "They will reach us in 40 minutes. Neither of them said what they both knew. In 40 minutes, station and everyone on it would be destroyed. They did not take prisoners. They did not negotiate. They simply consumed. "All hands," announced over the ship-wide channel. "This is Commander. You all know what we face today. You all know the odds. I will not lie to you and tell you that help is coming, because it is not. I will not tell you that we can win, because we probably cannot." He paused, looking around at his crew. They were scared. Of course they were scared, but they were not running. "What I will tell you is this: behind us is station. 50,000 civilians, families, children. If we fall, they fall, so we will not fall. We will stand. We will fight. And we will make the pay for every meter of space they take from us." A ragged cheer went up from the bridge crew. 30 minutes passed, 20, 10. The bioships grew larger on the. They were ugly things, grown rather than built. their hulls made of organic material that pulsed and shifted like living skin. Weapons pods dotted their surfaces like blisters. "All ships prepare for combat," ordered. "Fire on my command." "Commander," Myra suddenly shouted, "I'm detecting an anomaly." "Reinforcements." "No, sir, something else. Multiple contacts appearing at bearing 270 by 15. They just appeared out of nowhere." Frowned, that was impossible. Nothing could appear without a hyperspace signature, unless... On screen, the shifted and felt his breath catch in his throat. Ships, but that word was not big enough to describe what he was seeing. These were monsters, mountains of metal and fire, each one stretching nearly 50 kilometers from bow to stern. Their hulls were covered in armor plating so thick that it looked like the skin of some ancient beast. Weapon arrays lined their surfaces, hundreds of gun barrels and missile tubes and devices that could not even identify. There were 7 of them, arranged in a perfect V formation. "What are those?" Myra whispered. Before could answer, a communication channel opened. The voice that came through spoke Galactic Common, the standard language of the hegemony, but with a strange accent that no one had ever heard before. "Unknown vessels in conflict zone. This is Fleet Admiral of the Terran Defense Armada, commanding the mega-dreadnought Unbroken Will. You appear to be outmatched. Do you require assistance?" His mind went blank. Terran, Terra, the old name for Earth. Myra breathed. "Those ships are from Earth." "That's impossible," said. "Earth is a dead world, a failed civilization they don't have." "Then what are those?" They answered the question before could. Perhaps they were confused by the new arrivals. Perhaps they simply did not care. Either way, all 300 bioships opened fire on the human fleet. Plasma bolts and acid streams and biological missiles flew through space, a wall of destruction that should have overwhelmed any defense. The lead human ship, the Unbroken Will, did not even raise shields. The weapons hit its hull and splashed like water against stone, like rain against a mountain. The armor glowed briefly from the heat, then cooled. There was not a single scratch. Silence filled the bridge of the swift blade. Then the Unbroken Will fired back. A single beam of light erupted from its bow, a lance of pure energy that tore through space itself. It struck the center of the formation and simply erased everything it touched. 47 bioships vanished in an instant, not destroyed, not damaged, gone, as if they had never existed. "By the stars," Myra whispered. The remaining ships hesitated. For the first time in recorded history, the swarm seemed confused. Then they made a decision. They ran. All 253 surviving bioships turned and fled into hyperspace, leaving behind nothing but debris and fear. The communication channel crackled again. "Commander of the Hegemony Defense Fleet, this is Admiral. The threat has been neutralized. We request permission to dock with your station. I believe we have much to discuss." Realized his hands were shaking. He gripped the arm of his command chair to steady himself. "Admiral," he said, surprised that his voice was steady. "Permission granted, and thank you." "You are welcome, Commander. Today, humanity introduces itself to the galaxy. Let us hope it is the beginning of a friendship." The channel closed. Myra turned to, her face pale. "Commander, what just happened?" Watched as the 7 human megaships began their slow approach toward station. Each one was larger than anything he had ever seen. Each one carried more firepower than his entire fleet combined. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think the galaxy just changed forever." Aboard the Unbroken Will, Fleet Admiral stood at his command console, watching the hegemony vessels through the... He was 62 years old, with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. Beside him stood his second-in-command, Captain Sora. She was younger, fiercer, with a scar running down her left cheek from a training accident years ago. "That was almost too easy," she said quietly. "Though we're not expecting us, next time will be harder." "Do you think there will be a next time?" Smiled, but there was no humor in it. There is always a next time. Humanity learned that lesson long ago. He turned from the begin docking procedures, and Sora. "Yes, Admiral. Remind the crew to be polite. These people just learned that everything they believed about the universe was wrong. They are probably terrified." "Should they be terrified of us?" "Consider the question. Not if they choose to be our friends, but that choice is theirs to make. The docking clamps engaged, and humanity took its first step onto the galactic stage. The shuttle that carried Admiral to station was small compared to the monsters he commanded, but it was still larger than any shuttle the hegemony had ever built. Commander watched it approach through the station's observation window, trying to control his racing thoughts. Beside him stood Ensign Myra and a dozen other officers, all of them nervous, all of them curious. "What do we do?" asked Lieutenant, the station's chief security officer. "What do we say?" "We welcome them," replied. "They saved our lives. They saved 50,000 civilians. Whatever else they are not our enemies." "But how did they do it?" pressed. "How did a primitive species build ships like that? It's impossible." "Apparently not." The shuttle docked with a soft clang of metal against metal. There was a hiss of air as the pressure equalized, and then the door opened. Admiral was not what it expected. He had imagined a giant, perhaps, or some kind of evolved superbeing. Instead, the man who stepped through the door looked remarkably ordinary. He was of average height, with dark hair streaked with gray and calm eyes that seemed to carry the weight of many difficult decisions. He wore a simple gray uniform with no medals or decorations. Behind him came two others, a woman with short hair and a scar on her cheek, and a man carrying a data pad who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. "Commander," said, extending his hand, "I am Fleet Admiral of the Terran Defense Armada. Thank you for welcoming us aboard." Hesitated for just a moment, then took the offered hand. The human grip was firm but gentle. "Admiral, I don't know what to say. You saved us, all of us. We did what was right, nothing more." "But how?" the question burst out before it could stop it. "Our records say your species was centuries away from. How did you build those?" Smiled a thin and tired expression. "Your records were wrong, though I suppose we encouraged that mistake." He gestured toward the station's interior. "May we speak somewhere private? I have much to explain, and some of it is difficult." Led them to a conference room deep inside the station. Once the door was sealed and security protocols were activated, began to speak. 40 years ago," he said, "humanity detected your survey probes. We had just developed our own deep space sensors, primitive things compared to hegemony technology, but good enough to spot ships watching our world." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "We captured one of the probes. It took us 6 months to decode its data storage, but when we did, we learned everything. We learned about the hegemony, about the elder races, about how you had our species as primitive and irrelevant and marked us for eventual guidance." The woman with the scar spoke up. Her name was Director, and she was the head of Terran intelligence. "We read your history files. We saw what happened to other species who were guided by the hegemony. Client states, servitor races, species whose development was controlled until they were useful but never threatening." Her voice hardened. "We decided we would rather be threatening." Felt a chill run down his spine. "What did you do?" "We unified," said simply. "For the first time in human history, every nation on Earth agreed to work toward a single goal. We called it the Silent Ascension." Director took over the explanation. "Total secrecy was essential. If the hegemony learned what we were doing, they would stop us. So we created a false front. We continued broadcasting television and radio signals showing a world that was exactly what you expected. Divided, primitive, obsessed with petty conflicts. Meanwhile," continued, "we built hidden facilities on the moon, construction yards in the asteroid belt, factories orbiting Jupiter hidden by the planet's radiation field. Everything done in absolute silence with no electromagnetic emissions that could be detected from outside the solar system." 40 years, said. 40 years of work, every scientist, every engineer, every factory, all focused on a single purpose. "Building a fleet," said slowly. "Building a fleet," confirmed. 23 mega-dreadnoughts, 400 support vessels, orbital construction platforms that can produce warships faster than your largest shipyards. Myra, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "But how? We're talking about technology that took the elder races thousands of years to develop. How did you do it in 40? Director smiled. It was not a kind smile. "You assumed we were primitive because we had not left our planet, but space travel is not the only measure of intelligence. Humans are very good at solving problems, Commander, very good at finding new ways to do things." "We made mistakes," admitted. We had to reinvent many things that your species mastered long ago, but we also found solutions you never considered." "Why not?" asked. "Because you stopped looking," leaned forward in his chair. "The hegemony has not faced a true technological challenge in over 1,000 years. You have had no rivals, no competition, no reason to innovate. Your weapons are the same weapons your ancestors used. Your ships follow the same designs that were created centuries ago." He spread his hands. "Humanity had no such luxury. We knew we were starting from nothing. We knew we had to catch up to civilizations that were thousands of years ahead of us. So we pushed ourselves harder than any species has ever pushed." "And now," asked quietly. "Now we are here," stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. "Our fleet is small compared to the hegemony's total forces, but our ships are stronger, faster, and more powerful than anything you have ever built." He turned back to face the room. "We did not come here to conquer, Commander. We did not come here to start a war. We came here because we detected the offensive and knew that innocent people would die if no one helped." "And what do you want in return?" asked. It was the question everyone was thinking. Was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "We want to be left alone. We want to develop our own civilization without interference. And we want something that the hegemony has never given any species." "What?" "Respect." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Director broke the silence. "For 40 years we have watched the galaxy from the shadows. We have seen how the elder races treat those they consider beneath them. We have seen species stripped of their culture, their independence, their dignity." She stood, her eyes hard. "Humanity will not be another victim. We will not be guided. We will not be controlled. We will stand as equals, or we will stand alone." Looked at these strange beings from a forgotten world. They were smaller than most hegemony species. They were fragile, soft-skinned, short-lived. By every measure the galaxy used, they should have been nothing. But they had done something impossible. They had risen from primitive technology to galactic power in a single generation. They had built weapons that could destroy entire fleets, and they had done it all in secret, under the noses of the most powerful civilization in existence. Perhaps thought the galaxy's measures were wrong. "Admiral," he said slowly, "what happens now?" Smiled. For the first time it reached his eyes. "Now, Commander, we talk, we explain ourselves to your leaders, we negotiate our place in the galaxy." His smile faded. "And we prepare for what comes next." "What comes next?" "The attack was just the beginning. They will return with greater numbers, and when they do, the hegemony will need to make a choice, stand with humanity or stand alone." He looked out at the stars one final time. "I hope they choose wisely." Grand Council chamber on Nexus Prime had never been so crowded. Representatives from every elder race filled the great circular room. Ambassador of the Dominion sat in his usual place, his scales shifting nervously between green and purple. High Arbiter of the Crystalline Collective pulsed with agitated light. Even the swarm voice of the being called had been allowed to attend, despite the recent attack. And in the center of the room, at a small table that had been built just hours before, sat a single human. Her name was, and she was 63 years old. Her silver hair was pulled back from her face, and she wore a simple gray uniform that matched the one Admiral had worn. She had no guards, no assistants. She sat alone in a room full of beings who could destroy her with a thought. And she did not look afraid. "This council recognizes the representative of the Terran species," High Arbiter began. His voice echoed through the chamber like thunder. "You have requested this meeting to explain the unprovoked military action in hegemony space." Raised one eyebrow. "Unprovoked? Ambassador, we responded to a distress signal and defended hegemony assets from aggression. I believe the traditional response is gratitude, not accusation." Scales flushed dark orange. "You appeared with warships of unprecedented power. You concealed your development from the hegemony. You violated 17 provisions of the Observation Accords." "The Observation Accords," replied calmly, "apply to member species and signatories. Earth is neither. We were classified as a pre-spacefaring civilization and removed from active monitoring. That classification remains in your official records." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Furthermore, your observation of Earth was conducted without our knowledge or consent. Under your own laws, Ambassador, that makes us a subject of covert study, not a party to your agreements." The chamber erupted in noise. Clicks and whistles and rumbles filled the air as dozens of species expressed their outrage. "This is absurd," Swarm Voice's mandibles clicked furiously. "A species that was burning fossil fuels 200 years ago cannot simply appear with technology matching the elder races." "And yet," spread her hands, "here I am." A delegate stood, his scales bright red with anger. "How do we know this is not a trick, a deception? Perhaps another race built these ships and gave them to the humans to use as puppets." Smiled, it was not a warm smile. "I invite any species here to examine our technology. You will find no traces of hegemony design, no copies of elder race systems. Everything we have, we built ourselves." "Impossible," someone muttered. "You keep using that word," said quietly. "You have used it for centuries. Impossible for primitives to be intelligent. Impossible for lesser species to innovate. Impossible for anyone to challenge the elder races." She stood, and though she was smaller than almost everyone in the room, something in her presence made the delegates fall silent. "The hegemony has ruled this galaxy for 3,000 years. In that time, you have grown comfortable, lazy. You stopped pushing the boundaries of science because you believed you had discovered everything worth discovering. You stopped questioning your assumptions because you were certain you were right." Her voice hardened. "You looked at humanity and saw primitives burning oil and fighting wars. You never asked why we fought. You never wondered what we might become if we united. You simply marked us as irrelevant and moved on." "We offered guidance to primitive species," High Arbiter protested. "We helped them develop." "You controlled them," corrected. "You guided their development in directions that served your interests. You made them dependent on your technology, your trade, your protection. And when they were no longer useful, you discarded them." The chamber went very quiet. Humanity chose a different path. We chose to grow on our own terms, in our own way, at our own pace. We chose independence over guidance, struggle over comfort, freedom over safety. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of beings who had existed for longer than human civilization. "And now we stand before you as equals." Ambassador laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Equals, you have one fleet, we have thousands. Your appearance is impressive, but it changes nothing. The hegemony will simply adapt." "Will you?" asked softly. "We have studied your military for 40 years, Ambassador. We know your tactics, your weapons, your weaknesses. We know that your fleets have not faced a real challenge in over a millennium. We know that your admirals have never fought an enemy who could match them ship for ship." She reached into her pocket and placed a small device on the table. "This is a communication beacon. When the Council is ready to treat humanity as equals, not as primitives to be contained, not as threats to be managed, you may use it to request a meeting." She walked toward the door. "Wait," Swarm Voice called out. "You cannot simply leave. There are negotiations to be conducted, agreements to be made." Paused at the threshold. "I came here hopping for dialogue, for recognition that humanity has earned its place among the stars. Instead, I hear the same arrogance that made you dismiss us in the first place." She turned back to face the Council one last time. "One more thing, we have completed our analysis of military capabilities. They are planning a second offensive, much larger than the first. This time they will target your core worlds. The chamber erupted in panic. Its representatives began clicking frantically among themselves. "They believe the hegemony is too divided to respond effectively," continued over the noise. "Too caught up in internal politics and petty rivalries to mount a unified defense." She met High Arbiter's glowing eyes. "They are probably right, but that is not humanity's problem, not yet, perhaps not ever." She stepped through the door. "You know how to reach us if you change your minds." The door closed behind her, leaving the Grand Council in chaos. Scales were white with fear, a color no one had ever seen him display. "She is bluffing. She must be bluffing about the—" "Our intelligence suggests she is not," a quiet voice replied. It was Admiral who had observed the entire meeting from a side chamber. "We have detected unusual movements in the outer rim. They are gathering forces." "Then we must act," High Arbiter declared. "Mobilize the fleets, prepare our defenses." "With what forces?" asked tiredly. "They have already begun withdrawing ships to protect their own territory. The Crystalline Collective refuses to commit military resources without guarantees. The other races are waiting to see which way the wind blows." She looked at the closed door where the human ambassador had stood. For 3,000 years, the hegemony has stood united because no one challenged our dominance. Now, in a single day, a species we dismissed as primitive has shown us that we are not as powerful as we believed. She turned to leave, and the have noticed. 2 weeks later, the second offensive began. The swarm had learned from their first defeat. They did not attack isolated outposts or minor stations. They struck at the heart of hegemony power. Nexus Prime fell in a single day. The Grand Council chamber, where ambassadors had laughed at human primitiveness, became a hive node. Thousands died. Thousands more were captured for purposes too terrible to describe. The hegemony fractured. Each elder race retreated to defend its own territory, abandoning allies and breaking treaties that had stood for centuries. And somewhere, watching it all unfold, humanity waited. The communication beacon sat on Ambassador's desk, silent and still. She wondered how long it would take them to use it. She did not have to wonder long. The distress call came 3 weeks after Nexus Prime fell. It was not from the Grand Council, because the Grand Council no longer existed. It was not from the elder races, because the elder races had scattered like frightened animals. It was from Commander, now Admiral, leading what remained of the hegemony's united fleet. 17 ships against an armada of 2,000. Please, his voice crackled through the communication beacon. We cannot hold them. They will reach the inner colonies within hours. Millions will die. Children will die. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice broke. We were arrogant, we were blind. We treated you as insects when you were giants. I understand if you choose to let us fall, but please, please do not let the innocent suffer for our mistakes. Ambassador listened to the message in her office aboard the Unbroken Will. Beside her stood Fleet Admiral, his face unreadable. Well, she asked. This is your decision, Ambassador. Politically, we would be within our rights to let the hegemony burn. They dismissed us. They threatened us. They would have controlled us if they could. That is not what I asked. Was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. 40 years ago, I was a young officer in Earth's Navy. We had just discovered we were not alone in the universe. We learned that powerful beings had marked us as primitive and irrelevant. He walked to the window, looking out at the stars. I remember the fear. I remember the anger. But most of all, I remember the determination. We would prove them wrong, we said. We would show them what humanity could be. He turned back to face. We built ships that could destroy worlds. We created weapons that could end civilizations. We have the power now to do exactly what the hegemony did to others. Dismiss them, control them, let them suffer. His eyes met hers. But that is not what we became. That is not why we sacrificed 40 years of our lives. We built these ships to protect ourselves, yes. But we also built them because we believed the galaxy could be better. That someone had to stand for the weak against the strong. Smiled, it was the first real smile she had shown in weeks. Admiral, prepare the fleet, all ships. 23 mega-dreadnoughts, 400 support vessels, the entire Terran defense armada. They jumped to hyperspace as one. Admiral saw them arrive. One moment his small fleet was alone, facing an endless tide of bioships. The next moment, the darkness of space was filled with light as the human fleet appeared. 23 mountains of steel and fire, arranged in perfect formation. Their hulls gleamed under the distant stars. Their weapon arrays glowed with barely contained power. And at their heads, the Unbroken Will. This is Fleet Admiral of the Terran Defense Armada, a voice announced on all channels. We are addressing all species currently engaged in hostilities. The Armada hesitated. Even the swarm mind, which had conquered dozens of worlds without pause, felt something it had never experienced before. Doubt. Humanity does not seek conquest, continued. We do not want your worlds, your resources, or your submission, but we will not stand idle while genocide is committed. The human fleet began to move forward. Slowly at first, then faster, each ship falling into attack formation. The swarm will withdraw from all occupied territories within 72 hours, or face consequences they cannot imagine. Swarm voice, commanding the forces from her flagship, felt the collective mind of her species scream in confusion. They had never retreated. They had never negotiated. They consumed or they were consumed. There was no other way. But the memory of station burned in the swarm mind. 47 ships, erased in an instant by a single weapon shot. Now there were 23 of those ships, 400 more support vessels, an armada that, despite being smaller in number, radiated power like nothing they had ever encountered. "Hold position," ordered her fleet. "We will call their bluff." It was not a bluff. The Unbroken Will fired first. A beam of gravitational energy tore through space, cutting through bioships like a knife through paper. 50 ships died in the first second. Then the rest of the human fleet opened fire. Missiles that moved faster than light, cannon shots that bent space around them, weapons that they had never seen and could not understand. The human fleet advanced like a tide of destruction, unstoppable, inevitable. In 12 hours, the armada was broken. Swarm Voice transmitted the surrender herself, her mandibles trembling as she spoke words that no had ever spoken. "We yield, we withdraw. The swarm accepts the terms." The human fleet stopped advancing. Admiral's voice came through the communication channel, calm and steady. "Your surrender is accepted. You have 72 hours to withdraw from all occupied territories. Any vessel remaining after that time will be destroyed without warning." The fled. For 3 months after the battle, the galaxy tried to rebuild itself. The elder races emerged from their hiding places, ashamed and broken. The species they had once called lesser watched them with new eyes, seeing the weakness that had always been hidden behind the mask of power. And then came the day of the Nexus Accords. The signing took place aboard the Unbroken Will, in a great hall that humans had built specifically for this moment. Representatives from every species in the galaxy attended, some in person, others through holographic projection. Ambassador sat at the central table, a document spread before her. Beside her stood Admiral, Director, and representatives from every nation on Earth. Across from her sat the survivors of the Grand Council. Admiral represented the hegemony military. High Arbiter, humbled and quiet, spoke for the Crystalline Collective. Ambassador, his scales pale gray with exhaustion, signed for the Dominion. The terms were simple but revolutionary. Humanity would not rule the galaxy. They had no interest in empire, no desire for conquest, but they would guarantee the peace. They would protect the weak. They would ensure that no species would ever again be dismissed as irrelevant. "The age of the elder races is over," said as she signed the document. "Not because humanity has replaced you, but because the concept itself was always a lie. There are no elder races and lesser races. There are only beings struggling to survive, to grow, to become something better." She looked up at the assembled representatives. "Today, we choose to struggle together." One by one, the delegates signed. Admiral watched from the observation deck above, Ensign Myra, now Captain Myra, standing beside him. "I still don't understand," she said quietly. "They could have conquered us, all of us. Why didn't they?" Thought about Admiral's calm eyes, Ambassador's patient smile, the discipline and restraint of a species that had built weapons of ultimate destruction and chose not to use them for domination. "Because that's not who they are," he said finally. "They spent 40 years building the most powerful fleet in the galaxy, and all they wanted was to be respected, to be treated as equals. We gave them neither, and they still chose to save us." He shook his head slowly. "We called them primitive. We laughed at their weakness. We dismissed them as insects." Below, Ambassador finished the final signature. She looked up at the observation deck, and for a moment her eyes met. She nodded once, a simple acknowledgement between equals. "And they responded by becoming our protectors," finished. "Perhaps we were the primitive ones all along." The ceremony ended. The delegates dispersed. The Unbroken Will continued its silent orbit above the ruins of Nexus Prime, a reminder of what humanity had built and what they had chosen to do with it. In time, the station would be rebuilt. The old divisions would fade. New alliances would form based on mutual respect rather than ancient hierarchies. The galaxy's arrogance had collapsed. And in its place, something better had risen, a future where a forgotten species from a small blue planet stood as guardians of peace, proving that greatness was not measured in age or power, but in the choices made when power was finally achieved. The stars still burned, the darkness still waited. But now humanity watched over them all. And the galaxy was no longer afraid.